1941. Dawn seeping through low mist over the Oral-Tula road as 4th Panzer Division's lead elements grind past birch, stands, and churned black earth. They expected another easy morning. Tracks rattle, antenna whips twitch, and the squat silhouettes of Panzer Atharathia and short-barreled Panzer IVs nose forward in company columns, engines droning under the grey lid of sky. They were sure the Soviets would break. Somewhere ahead, in a shallow swale beyond a hedgerow of alder and birch, 12 TT-34s sit engine idling, diesel breath hanging white in the cold. The ambush is patient. Inside the lead Soviet tank, oil and cordite mix with the metallic tang of November's approach. The 76.2 mm Fi-34 gun locked across the arc, the two-man turret cramped and loud. Weakness hides inside strength. The driver keeps his boots light on the pedals as the twin 5-cylinder WW2 diesel, a 500 horsepower heartbeat, throbs against the hull plates, the Christie suspension ready to spring. Power waits to be unleashed. A German scout car noses the curve and halts, binoculars flashing, before the road erupts with clanking steel and radio chatter. Achtung, Panzervorrats! Rising and falling against the birch trunks. Momentum feeds confidence. The first Ti-34 rises from the swale, as if the earth itself has given birth to armour. Glacis sloped at 60 degrees, shedding dew and disbelief, the wide tracks biting through mire where others would bog. The ground itself favours it. At 400 metres the F-34 barks, the crack rolling across the field as a Panzer II high lurches, armour plate spalling inward, smoke purling from the turret ring like torn fabric. One shot, one lesson. German 50mm rounds spark and ricochet from the T-34's angled nose, ringing off like struck bells, the impacts gouging paint but not resolve. Sudden fear replaces certainty. Another Soviet gun speaks, and a short-barreled Panzer IV, meant to smash infantry, takes a hit square on the turret face and shudders to a halt, crew hatches slamming open in frantic silhouettes. The weight of miscalculation lands. Colonel Mikhail Kachukov's 4th Tank Brigade has chosen its killing ground well. Reverse slopes, soft shoulders, flanking lanes through the birches, turning the road into a channel where German doctrine tightens like a fist. The hunter is now the trap. Soviet loaders heave shells from racks, knuckles raw and blackened, while commanders double as gunners, eyes pressed to simple sights that are good enough today, breath fogging the glass, imperfect yet unstoppable. A Panzer II tries to pivot for a side shot, clattering down the ditch, its 5 cab K struggling against the angle and thickness of 45mm and relate plate that behaves like more when it is sloped. Physics joins the battle. Over the radio net. Voices harden and fray. Orders clipped into noise as the lead company stalls in fire and confusion, unprepared for a tank they were told was crude and clumsy. Arrogance meets reality. Heinz Guderian will later write with cool candour about this very shock tea. We had nothing that could equal it. The admission tastes like smoke. The T-34s surge and break, firing from short halts, their low silhouettes weaving through gaps where only tractors had gone the season before, sowing wheat, and now fire. The field is their ally. German grenadiers scatter for ditches, as a Soviet Hull machine gun scythes the verge, clods leaping and helmets dipping, the air stinking of wet soil and burning oil. The human scale returns. A Panzer IV swings wide to flank, but slides in the muck. Tracks flinging black ribbons as another 76 Numias round hammers the side plate and blows the stowage box apart in a storm of splinters and flame. Movement turns to ruin. In the smoke, a T-34 clanks forward, paint blistered, vision slits dripping condensation. The driver riding the clutch with the easy brutality of a man who has ploughed this ground since childhood. Familiar hands on unfamiliar war. More engines approach from the east, the Soviet line deepening, as if the forest itself is armoured, while the German column compresses and knots, gun barrels slewing left and right without a clean solution. Confidence fractures completely. Guderian's armoured spearhead, so swift on paper maps, finds its point blunted here by steel geometry, diesel thunder, and a design the briefings never respected. The advance stops cold. The birches flicker orange as burning fuel rolls into the drainage cuts, and the day, only an hour old, feels suddenly ancient with the knowledge that a toy has become a terror. Laughter dies 4 months into Operation Barbarossa. The armoured spearheads of Army Group Center had carved long black wounds into Soviet maps and believed momentum itself would finish the work. Confidence was a fuel more intoxicating than gasoline. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group tore north of Kursk and through Oral toward Mtsensk under the banner of Operation Typhoon. Its lead element, the 4th Panzer Division, tasked to pry open the southern gate to Moscow. Speed was their doctrine. Their columns were a study in German method Panzer III H and J with 5 Semi-L-42 guns, short-barreled Panzer IV OSF, DG with 7 Hive Seacock K-37 L-24, motorized infantry in half-tracks, and 3.7 SAM PaK-36 anti-EV tank guns trundling behind like obedient hounds. Precision defined their stride. Radio nets knit companies to battalions and battalions to corps. Stuka dive. Bombers on call. Artillery plotted by map square. And reconnaissance screens fanned ahead for the next weak seam to exploit. The machine moved as one. Across the line, the Red Army bled in retreat while trying to stand, dispersing new tank brigades from the wreckage of shattered mechanized corps, and feeding them into the line where the maps showed roads and the earth promised cover. Desperation shaped resolve. From Kharkov's design bureau to Ural assembly halls, the T-34 had been born in fire and argument. A 26-28-ton hull of welded plates sloped at 60 degrees, a 45 Manev glasses behaving like far more, a 76.2 minor F-34 gun, and wide tracks to float over soil the Germans called unroaded. Its character was purposeful simplicity. Under the clattering plates a WW2 diesel breathed roughly 500 horsepower into the Christie suspension, its fuel less prone to burn, its grunt built for cross-country thrust, not parader ground polish. It preferred mud to cobble. Yet inside that hull lived compromise. A 2-man turret that made the commander serve as gunner. A narrow turret ring that cramped movement. Optics less refined than German glass. And radios. 7 once TK3 sets, issued to too few vehicles. Strength wore flaws openly. The Soviet crews were a mix of veterans and rushed replacements, some with barely weeks on their machines, ordered to hold the Oral-Mtsensk line under General Mikhail Katukov's 4th Tank Brigade and the hard driving of General Dmitry Lilyushenko's 1st Guards, Rifle Corps. Inexperience met intent. For the Wehrmacht, the campaign's arithmetic seemed settled by late September, cities taken, river lines crossed, and Soviet formations shattered. The door knocker, PaK-36 sufficient against T-26 and BT tanks, and the short 7.5 cm's of the Panzer IV adequate to blast infantry out of trenches. They underestimated the unknown. The terrain before Mtsensk did not read like a mapboard. It heaved with birch stands, ravines, and sodden fields. Perfect country for a machine with wide shoes and angled armour to play chess against a blade meant for straight thrusts. Ground would choose the victor. When first reports of the T-134 filtered into German headquarters, diesel engines, sloped armour, 76 Minanevd gun, some staff officers wrote it off as another clumsy Soviet brute, uncomfortable and poorly made, fast only on paper. Arrogance smothered curiosity. The Panzer Astra's 5 cm Ural-42 could punch through about 50 mm at close range on flat plate, and the Panzer IV's stubby 7.5 cm L-24 through heavy HE well but AP poorly, numbers that looked respectable until they met a 45 Mummus Glacis canted at 60 degrees. Geometry humbled ballistics. German anti-tank gunners already whispered a bitter nickname for their 3.7 cm drill gun, Hirasanklopfer, the army door knocker, because its shot tended to bounce with a sound like fate tapping a coffin lid. Experience sharpened language. Soviet planners understood their advantage was situational, not absolute. The T-34 was no miracle weapon, but a tool that, placed well and moved decisively, could disrupt a division's script long enough to buy Moscow days. Time was the currency. Katukov's order was simple. Force the enemy off the road into the gullies, strike from reverse slopes, and vanish into the tree line before the Luftwaffe could mark the muzzle flashes. Ambush became doctrine. On the German side, the plan remained relentless: fix, flank, and finish, believing that Soviet steel would once again split under combined arms, with Pioneers and 8.8 cm flak ready to answer any stubborn shape that refused to die. Habits held fast. But the first set, peace clashes in early October, wrote a new margin note in Guderian's diary. Why had nothing that could equal it? A sentence that carried more weight than any staff map's arrow. Recognition replaced scorn. Between Oral and Mitsensk, the clash mattered beyond the day because it forced adaptation. The call for longer 5 cm 60 guns on Panzer IR, the demand for a high-velocity 7.5 cmers on Panzer IV, and the genesis of a new German design study that would become the Panther. Shock became catalyst. It also mattered because it taught Soviet brigadiers how to turn the T-34's raw strengths into battlefield rhythm, short halts, flank shots, covered withdrawals, and the ruthless use of mud as ally rather than enemy. Learning became survival. Field Marshal Ewald von Kleist would later call the TA-34 the best tank in the world. Of its day, a verdict born not from flattery, but from the hard calculus of busted tracks and burning paint. Respect followed fear. Thus the stage at Mintsensk was set with clear contrasts. Radioed precision against diesel bluntness, short guns against long slopes, speed on roads against speed through fields. And each side believed the other would blink first. Only one belief could live. The Soviet T-34 T-76 was a study in ruthless prioritization, a 26-30-ton hull of welded rolled plate with a 45 mm glacis canted at 60 degrees, a two-man turret wrapped around the 76.2 mm F-34, and wide tracks that spread weight like a snowshoe over mud and thaw. It was built to go where roads ended. Beneath its deck plates, the V2I-34 diesel, a 38.E litre, 125-cylinder aluminum block, pushed roughly 500 horsepower through a crash 4-speed gearbox that punished weak ankles and rewarded brute timing. The engine breathed like winter wind. Christie's suspension gave the hull long travel and speed over churned ground, the bogies flexing under shock, while the 500 Muller-Ullrich tracks clawed at peat, clay, and snow with low ground pressure that humbled narrower shod foes. It preferred mud to math. The gun F4 threw a 6.3 GBR 350 IAP shell at around 60-6-80 miss, enough to break open a Panzer Zythia at battle ranges and smash a short-barreled Panzer IV before it could answer with anything but high explosive. Its voice carried weight. But the turret was a compromise no basket, a narrow ring, a commander who was also the gunner, and optics that lagged behind German glass. PT-47 periscope and a simple telescopic sight that did the job, barely. Awareness cost effort. Fuel was diesel. Less volatile than gasoline and more forgiving when rounds sparked and spalled. And the hull profile was low enough that birch trunks and wheat stubble could hide a death that moved at 30 and 40 km crossed country. It survived by shape. Manufacturing was crude yet clever. Castings were expedient, welds with gaps filled and ground, and armor hardness that could spall inside under shock, spraying steel needles that turned interior air into a cutting room. Ruggedness had a price. Air filters were poor in 1941, dust carving engines in weeks. and the heavy clutch demanded a driver with farmer's legs and a rhythm learned by bruised shins and burned palms. Stamina became a skill. Doctrine tried to match the metal ambush from reverse slopes, short halts to fire, withdrawal into woods, and a bias for flanking thrusts that turned German road marches into kill boxes where the slope did half the work. Tactics fit terrain. Soviet radios 70-100 TKL-3 were scarce, so flag signals and prearranged maneuvers replaced chatter, and brigade commanders leaned on simple orders that survived static, fear, and smoke. Silence forced simplicity. German armour, by contrast, was a watchmaker's argument Panzer Theosf. HKJ with the 5cm KK-30AL-42, a three-man turret that freed the commander to command, and optics polished to clarity that cut through haze. Their edge was control. The Maybach HL-120 TRM gasoline engine gave 300 horsepower to Panzer Uthera and IV alike, smooth on roads and responsive in formation, but the narrower tracks and higher ground pressure punished them in Thor and Ploughland. Mud was a thief. Panzer IV's short 7.5 cm Lover 24 excelled at high explosive support, blowing open bunkers and hedgerows, yet against the T-34's glacis its blunt AP struck and died, a heavy fist landing on a sloped shield. Power met angle, German doctrine, combined arms, radios in every command tank, off-drag tactic that pushed initiative down, meant a company fought like a Chua, artillery and Stukas tuned to grid squares and seconds. Harmony killed quickly. But harmony needed a weakness to exploit, and the T-34 denied the easy ones. It crossed fields where maps said, impassable, ignored, door knocker, 3.7 cm pack 36 hits on its nose, and chose when to show its side. Choice is a weapon. Field tests with captured T-34s impressed and irritated German engineers. Cross-country speed was excellent. Turret ergonomics, unsatisfactory. Vision, restricted. A verdict that would soon echo in design meetings from Kummersdorf to Mayan. Respect came with a pen. In 1941, at the time of its appearance, the T-34 was superior to any tank in the world, wrote F.W. von Mellenthin with the cold memory of burned columns and bounced shot. Superiority had witnesses. Soviet crew drills compensated for flaws. Loaders trained to muscle shells from racks on a moving deck. Commanders learned to snap between the periscope and sight without losing the thread, and drivers practiced clutch brake pivots that turned fields into racetracks. Muscle replaced mechanisms. Ammunition was Doctrine 2 AP for the first shock, HE to strip infantry and guns, and armor-piercing composite rounds arriving in trickles that mattered more in 1942 than at Metsensk. Supply-bent tactics. On the German side, after-action sheets from early October 1941 carried new instructions in underlined script: fire at flanks, aim for the tracks and turret ring, bring 8.8 cm flak forward for direct fire, and use smoke to blind the periscope. Experience rewrote manuals. When Pazafur finally received the long 5 cm Elva 60, penetration tables improved. But in the birch groves of oral country, the first line still ran up against the physics of 60 degrees and a hull that sat lower than the hedges. Numbers could not lift the nose. Inside the T-34, heat and fumes chewed at lungs. The floorless turret forced men to dance around spent casings, and every jolt slammed knees into steel, while the WW2 roared like a factory trapped in a box. Endurance was armour too. Inside the Panzer E, headsets crackled with Fugi 5 radio nets, turret crews spoke through throat mics, and the commander stood free behind a binocular sight, issuing bearings like a conductor with a baton. Clarity was a weapon. Both machines announced their lineage in motion. The T-34 shrugged off ruts and fences, and seemed to breathe with the soil, while the German panzers held perfect line on hardpack and faltered where the land turned to sponge. Character showed in tracks. By Mitsensk, the lesson fused into doctrine on both sides. The Soviets would let the Germans enter the pocket and cut the exit with diesel and slope, and the Germans would call for longer guns, wider shoes, and a new panzer with slanted plates. Adaptation had a sound. October 6, 1941. Near Metsensk. The birch wood lines steamed in the chill as 4th Panzer Division's lead companies rolled into a shallow bowl of fields and hedgerows. They did not see the angles waiting. Katyukov's 4th Tank Brigade lay in seams and folds of ground, T-34s tucked behind reverse slopes with engines ticking over and loaders sweating under felt hats and fumes. Patience loaded the guns. At 380 meters the first F-34 spoke. A flat crack that kicked dirt from the glisis and hurled a 6.30 kilogram AP shell through a Panzer Hartreise frontal plate with a shriek and a puff of grey smoke. Confidence ruptured with steel. The Germans wheeled hard for the flanks, Maybachs howling. 5 Sonarview's Cap K barrels snapping to new bearings as gunners searched for pale side plates through swaying sight drums. Speed met geometry. Shells sparked and ricocheted from the T-34's 60-degree nose, sparks sliding like rain down a slate roof as the diesel kept its heavy heartbeat under the rattling plates. Impact turned to impotence. Packwork nicked. Anti-tank gunners' cry bled over the net as 3.7 cm's shots pinned and died. A Hiri Sanklopfer, nickname now an accusation instead of a joke. A punchline became a verdict. Katyukov's map was the ground itself. He let the road fill with targets, then snapped a wedge through the hedgerow to shear the column and rake the halted panzers from the side. Ambush became lesson. A Soviet commander hunched at the sight, commander and gunner in one body, rocking his turret to clear the periscope, then calling Zabronu for armor piercing as his loader heaved brass from racks and slammed the breech shut. Discipline overcame design. A Panzer IV tried to answer with high explosive, the blunt 7.5 cm bursting black earth into curtains that hid nothing from sloped armor, while the T-34 traversed and fired again from a short halt. Fire rhythm beat finesse. German grenadiers spilled from half-tracks to drag 8.8 cm flak forward by brute hand and curses, the long barrels nosing through ditch grass to find a clean line on the low Soviet hulls. Desperation sought leverage. The first 8.8 cm cracked like a hammer on an anvil, and a T-34 reeled, track thrown and side plate torn, its crew boiling out under a scythe of machine gun tracers as diesel burned in a greasy, orange pillar. Even strength bleeds. On the other flank, a T-34 lunged through a beat field, tracks hissing mud, swung its nose across the side of a Panzer IV, and punched twice into the turret ring until the cupola spat flame. Flank shots settled arguments. Let them pass and strike from the flanks, from behind folds of ground. Katyukov would later write, a simple sentence that explained a day's worth of wrecks and smoke. Simplicity killed with economy. Heinz Guderian's staff car crouched by the hedgerow as he watched the fight through binoculars, the staccato of radios and the whine of dive sirens, knitting into a sound he would not forget. Shock has its own timbre. We had nothing that could equal it. He would record afterward. The ink as cold as the October wind that carried the taste of cordite across the Oral-Mtsensk road. Admission replaced contempt. The division diary tightened into orders. Aim for tracks, for turret rings for the rear, bring up the long 8.8s, avoid frontal duels, use smoke, and runners sprinted under branches dripping with condensation and ash. Doctrine bent under fire. A T-34 backed in low gear, exhaust coughing blue. Then surged forward again, firing on the move in bounding leaps, its Christie suspension cushioning enough to keep the sight picture alive for a heartbeat. Momentum served accuracy. German optics found one clean line at 600 meters, and the long barrel answered, the 8.8 chewing a hole through a T-34's cheek and crumpling the cast turret like wet clay as the crew slumped and stilled. Power finally bit back. But the bowl was already theirs. The Soviet wedge had opened a gap and poured gunfire into it. The road a Kul Dar, sack of wrecks with black, rimmed hatches and scattered packs, and the Panzer's tidy intervals broken into desperate angles. Order became a memory. By noon the field stank of hot oil and wet earth. The air stitched with smoke that drifted in low bands as crows circled, and the last shots came as single, angry barks from hedgerows. Noise thinned to aftermath. The German advance paused on a map thick with arrows, the staff tracing new routes around a place that had just rewritten their tables, while Katukov's brigade slid back into the tree line with dented armour and full confidence. A front learned humility. In that hour, the toy tank proved the opposite. Diesel thunder sloped defiance, and a rough machine wielded with cunning turned laughter into reports, and reports into requests for new guns. Reality erased the smile. Winter 1941-42 closed over the Ural-Mosensk fields like a steel lid, and what had been surprise hardened into doctrine on both sides. Fear became a planner. German workshops lengthened barrels and rewrote tables. Panzer III received the 5 Semikaka 39 Eldra 60, Panzer IV sprouted the long 7-point Semkiup K40 L43 and later L48, and Stugger III traded its stubby gun for the Stuck 40, turning an assault gun into a tank killer. Metal learned new verbs. Anti-tank units rolled out the 7.5 CMI Pak 40 in growing numbers, its sharp-nosed AP biting through T-34 side plates at distances that once felt safe, while Marder I and Tai slapped captured Soviet 76.2 Marev guns onto thin hulls to put mobile teeth at crossroads. Improvisation gained fangs. Close-arc combat teams, drilled with Hafthulladung magnetic charges, and later Panzerfausts and Panzerstrecks. A street-level answer to slope and speed that taught grenadiers to think in angles and shadows. Courage edged into desperation. On paper, the balance began to tilt. Longer German guns, better optics. Refined crew drill. But the ground still listened to the diesel that crossed ploughland faster and fought from short halts with sloped defiance. The land kept a secret allegiance. Soviet plants answered shock with simplification and scale. The 4-speed box gave way to a 5-speed that spared clutches. Multicyclone air cleaners stopped eating engines, and radios became standard in company leaders instead of rare trophies. Rough became reliable. The turret evolved too, model 1943's, hex shape with improved casting and, at last, a commander's cupola that put more eyes into the fight and fewer elbows into the gunner's ribs. Vision caught up with will. Logistics marched with the tanks. External cylindrical fuel drums multiplied range. Spare track links hung like iron rosaries on sloped cheeks, and winter kits smeared whitewash across green so the machine could blend into birch and snow. Camouflage learned to whisper. German after-action sheets, stamped and wary, carried the same refrain. Avoid frontal duels, hit from the flanks, 8.8 forward, and crews learned to spot the T-34's low nose first by sound, then by the way it made mud behave like road. Recognition preceded survival. Hasso von Manteuffel would later place it without flourish. In 1941-42 the T-34 was clearly superior to our tanks, a sentence as level as a firing table and as heavy as a wrecked column. Respect bled out of memory. In the summer of 1942 the Panzer IVF-2 TG finally met the T-34 nosy on as an equal at practical ranges. The long 7.5 SAM sending flat, hard shots that could punch through the glacis under good light and steady hands. Confidence returned, cautious and conditional. But factories east of the Urals were not standing still. They pushed out Ti-34 model 1942s by the trainload while designers sketched a bigger ring and longer gun on drafting paper that smelled of oil and cold tea. Quantity guarded time for invention. By autumn, Stu Guy-free batteries lurked in tree lines like patient spiders. their low hulls and LO-48 guns waiting for silhouettes to cross a lane before lashing out with precise, almost surgical cruelty. Ambush-changed uniforms. German infantry carried tungsten cord Piesgarau, 40 for the 5 Samamio, a short-range ace that could bite when ordinary steel glanced. Soviet crews, reading the battlefield by ear and stump, learned to keep angles honest and show only cheeks and wheels by choice. Physics became a contest of intent. Around Stalingrad, whitey-washed T-34s ran the factory, took front relay straight from Krasny Oktyabr and Barricady, rolling through shell smoke, and hurled bricks to deliver point-blank HE into buildings and disappear behind a rail embankment before the 8.8 could find them. Cities grew tank instincts. The Germans answered with more PaK-40s by the battery, better armor-piercing caps on long 7.5 cm rounds, and squad leaders lecturing. Tracks, turret ring and rear make the slope mean nothing. Training tried to drain surprise. Yet rumour was its own weapon. Units began to use a single word on the net. T-bio virundres, ig. As a warning that tightened throats and shortened sentences, the diesel clatter now as recognizable as a marching song. Sound carried dread. Late 1943. The Soviet answer to the long gun duel arrived. The T-34 85 with an enlarged turret ring, a true 3-man turret, and an 85mm gun D5T at first. Then Zis 53 that steadied nerves against tigers and panthers. Organization became firepower. A Red Army tanker from a Guards brigade described the change in a field letter preserved in a regimental file. At last the commander can command, he wrote, and the gun speaks like a grown man. A simple relief translated into harder, more coordinated blows. Roles turned into rhythm. On the German side, the Panther carried the sloped gospel home, its 7.5C Nederrisen Cade K-42 a deadly, flat-shooting answer, but teething troubles and thin-side armour meant that, in the same fields that birthed the shock, flanking T-34s remained a problem no table alone could solve. Copies still learned humility. At Kursk, the two lines of adaptation smashed into each other, the long 7.5s and 8.As reaping at range, the T-34s massed by the 100 on chosen axes, smoke mines, and artillery thickening the air until gunners could taste grit with each breath. The duel became a storm. Numbers whispered behind every gun report, and both sides counted in platoons lost and factories humming. But in the moment a loader's raw palms and a driver's bruised shins were the arithmetic that decided whether a slope or a barrel ruled a hedgerow. Human effort closed the gap. By the end of 1943, neither side laughed. One adapted to kill the shape it feared. The other refined that shape and multiplied it until the very sound of its approach bent plans out of true. The echo of diesel taught caution. June 23, 1944. Belarusian dawn mist filling the hollows as assault guns cough smoke and T-34 Ho-85s idle in pressed ranks beneath birch crowns. The offensive has a heartbeat. 4 Soviet fronts align like gears, 1st Baltic, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Belarusian, each with tank armies stacked behind infantry shock groups, each map marked with arrows that promise depth, encirclement, and no pause. The plan is industrial in scale. Engines warm to a coarse growl, 5-man crews elbow to stations, the new 3-man turret giving the commander his eyes back, while the Zes 5385 Munnes waits to speak in flat, hard syllables. Capability has matured. Artillery lands like a weather event. Thousands of tubes and Stalin's organs, smearing the forward line until trenches lose definition and the wire hangs in shredded curtains. Sound becomes pressure. Then the T-34s move, wide tracks floating over wet peat, bow waves of earth curling from the glacis. Platoons fanning to the flanks while the lead elements chew up the first anti-tank tank belt by speed and angle. Momentum chooses the path. German fieldworks, planned with geometrical care, real underweight and timing, Pack 40s crack back and take their toll. But the intervals fill with more silhouettes, and every gap births 3 more red stars. Quantity turns to presence. Fewer! Fewer! Snaps across a company net as a gun team hammers the side of a Soviet hull at 200 meters, only to watch another T-34 take its lane before the smoke thins. Hope collapses to seconds. Army Group Center's staff logs will call it what it is. An operational rupture that cannot be patched at the regimental level. Divisions broken. Corps reduced to map pins, and roads west choked with wrecks and refugees. Catastrophe gets a date. Over 5,000 Soviet tanks and assault guns commit across the fronts during Operation Bagration, their spearheads punching river crossings at night, their exploitation echelons feeding forward like an assembly line on rails. Scale replaces subtlety. The 85 mm gun changes duels once claustrophobic. Panthers still reap at range. Tigers still kill in measured arcs. But the T-34 185 answers with a steadier sight picture and turret discipline that stacks hits on cupolas and turret rings. Parity buys confidence. A German grenadier scrawls in a pocket diary later found in a ditch near Vitebsk. They came out of the smoke and the ground itself. Fast, low, and many. Description shrinks to awe. On the Soviet net the words are old and unadorned. Zerodinu! Zastolina! As crews bound by hedges. Then break the second line with short halts and HE over open sights against guns that refuse to displace. Ritual becomes shock. By noon on the 3rd day, whole regiments are missing. By the 10th, Minsk is a pocket, and Army Group Center is a shell with holes where divisions used to be, its commanders writing reports that read like obituaries. A front ceases to exist. Numbers make the air colder, hundreds of kilometers gained in weeks, hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and columns of T-34s burning through fuel and rubber faster than staff officers can pencil it back in. Logistics pant to keep up. The human cost rides with the triumph. Burned paint and blown hatches spotted along verges, crews pulled from blackened turrets, and medics crouched in wheel ruts with morphine and a cigarette for a man who cannot hear anymore. Victory smells like oil. On the Vistula, bridges shiver under tracked weight as First Guards, tank army surges in winter 1945, dusting snow with exhaust soot, in Silesia. Factory towns flash by as the sight drums settle on fleeing half-tracks. Distance loses meaning. German commanders adjust tactics, trade space for time, and concentrate long 7.5 cm's guns on choke points. But every answer meets a fresh weight of steel and a habit of movement that denies neat, sequential battles. The tempo is unforgiving. A Panther troop angles for side shots in a village lane and kills 3, before the 4th T-34 Su-85 rakes its lower plate from a doorway and turns the ambush inward with 2 quick, practiced rounds. Skill meets numbers and bleeds. Bring up the 8.8, direct fire, is still the emergency, and still it works when sighted well. Yet even as one diesel spirals into a pillar of flame, 2 more grind past in second gear, infantry clinging to hulls, eyes narrowed against grit and fear. Progress ignores pain. By April, when the Oder crossings boil with traffic and Berlin's suburbs hear the tracks like approaching thunder, the TR-34 has become the ordinary face of an extraordinary advance, most common shape in the deadliest chapter. Icon and instrument fuse. In the Tiergarten, T-3485s angle their hulls against rubble piles. Loaders roar palmed and grinning through dust as the 85 mm spits brick and steel at a corner where a Panzerfaust might wait with a boy behind it. Dominance still costs blood. Gun camera film belongs to airmen, but the tank's proof lies in gunners' notches, burned gloves, and charred mantlets, and in the silence of an enemy radio net that once barked bearings and now whispers road names as prayers. Psychology breaks before steel. From Mitsensky's birches to Berlin's stones, The sloped hull has written its argument across a continent in exhaust and track marks, and the laughter that greeted it in 1941 survives only as the preface to a report on defeat. The fields, not the sky, belong to them. Autumn 1941. Night trains groan east with machine tools jigs and families packed among crates labelled Ketch PZ and STZ. Steam hissing as guards wave lanterns through sleet at sidings bound for the Urals. The empire of steel uproots itself to live. Factory No. 183 reappears in Nizhny Tagil under tin roofs and snow breath. HTZ at Chelyabinsk turns into Tankograd, and Krasnoye Sormovo at Gorky welds by river light as sparks fall like orange snow. Production resumes under exile. The Peyton Institute's automatic submerged arc welding rigs hum over hull seams. Castings replace milled angles where they can, and the T-34 sheds machining hours the way a runner drops weight. Efficiency becomes armour too. Rubber is scarce and besieged, so all steel road wheels click and ring along new lines, while simplified gearboxes and multicyclone air cleaners arrive to keep the WW2 diesel breathing in dust and winter. Rough turns reliable. Costs fall by nearly half from 1941 to 1942 as fixtures standardize and parts interchange. The turret evolves into the hex casting, then stretches its ring to take the 85 mm, and the hull learns to be made not perfect, but repeatable. Perfection gives way to volume. Numbers turn into weather. Roughly 12,500 T-34s in 1942, about 15,800 in 1943, with peak months over 200 hulls rolling from east of the Volga to the Urals. Quantity becomes climate. By comparison, 1943 German lines push out around 3,000 Panzer IVs and 700 Panthers, a formidable total that still sits smaller than the T-34 column alone. Arithmetic tightens throats. Inside the plants, sirens blow 3 shifts through the dark. Women on cranes, teenagers at presses. Foremen with frost on their mustaches reading quotas under chalkboard dates. Labour becomes doctrine. War is a war of motors. Stalin tells the country in February 1942. A sentence that walks straight from radio sets into production orders and overtime rosters. The slogan becomes a schedule. Engines leave in stacks. V2s tested on benches that shake the floor and go to railheads with crates of 76.2 man error and then 85 manner of ammunition, spare track lengths, and canvas rolls stitched with numbers and grease. Supply acquires rhythm. Field repair battalions, Rembezi, sprout along the roads, hauling wounded tanks with Komintern and Voroshilovets tractors, swapping transmissions under birch stands, and sending patched hulls back with chalked slogans on the glacis. Recovery keeps spearheads fat. The railways carry the weight, broad gauge arteries pumping east to west. And when the push outruns the rails, Studebaker US-6 and ZIS-55 trucks grind up the verges with drums of diesel and belts of 7.62 mm under planks. Rubber and rails make steel move. Lend-Lease is not the hero of the T-34's birth, but it becomes the circulatory system, almost 2,000 Western locomotives, thousands of railcars, hundreds of thousands of trucks, and miles of telephone cable that keep tank brigades fed with fuel and shells. Logistics turns speed into endurance. Training scales to match the flow. Omsk, Kazan, and Ulyanovsk schools run crews through gunnery, navigation by stump and steeple, and the brute art of clutch brake pivots until hands know levers the way farmers know reins. Skill is manufactured, too. At the front, assembly lines briefly touch battle lines. Stalingrad's factory teams shove T-34s straight from floor to street in 1942, and later, workshops at the step edge pre-fit winter kits and radio sets so brigades can roll the hour they detrack. Distance between spanner and gun shrinks. German industry answers with its own surge. Panthers refined, long 7.5 cm rounds shipped in crates smelling of graphite, but complexity drags and bombing bites, while the East demands replacements faster than Westphalian precision can supply them. Time punishes elegance. Albert Speer will later admit that the T-34's sloped armour and broad tracks made a deep impression on German designers, and Germany's answer, Panther, shows the lesson in steel. Imitation measures respect. Production tables are only the preface. The proof lies in depots, where green hulls queue by company and battalion, in fuel dumps, where men stand on drums like checker pieces, and in the way losses in January are replaced by march without arguments at staff tables. Continuity replaces fragility. A German company commander near Vitebsk writes in June 1944 that his order of battle is correct on paper in the morning, reduced by nightfall, a private record of a unit eaten by pace as much as by shot. Morale erodes under math. On Soviet manifests, each tank is a serial number and a date. On German situation reports, each one is a problem that returns tomorrow with a fresh crew and a full ammunition rack. Persistence wears an opponent down. By 1944, the avalanche of steel is not a metaphor but a schedule. Trainloads of T-34 85s, crates of Z-size of 53 barrels, spare engines, and track pins pushed forward on timetables that read like attack plans. Industry becomes an offensive arm. When the columns move west, Belorussia, Poland, the Oder, their momentum is not only crew courage and gunnery tables, it is coal at Magnitogorsk, or at Kuznetsk, electricity on a winter night in Nizhny Tagil, and a welder's steady hand under a flaring hood. Every rivulet feeds the flood. In the summer of 1945, the tracks cooled on the Tiergarten avenues, and the green hulls idled among ruins where eagles once stood, their angled plates reflecting a weak sun that could not burn away the cordite smell. Silence measured the distance from contempt to respect. Reports that had begun with scoffing now closed with a historian's brevity. As Heinz Guderian's line, "We had nothing that could equal it," sat beside casualty tables and requisitions for longer guns, the ink as stark as the wrecks along the Orel-Mitsensk road. The laughter had been filed away. F.W. von Mellenthin, remembering the first winter, wrote that, in 1941-42, the T-34 was clearly superior to our tanks, and Ewald von Kleist told interrogators the Russian machine was the best tank in the world. At its appearance, a chorus of adversaries whose words still ring like struck steel. Respect arrived late and hard. In numbers the verdict was louder still. Over 57,000 T-34s built during the war, and more than 80 Zalarosen by the time post-war production in Czechoslovakia and Poland tapered. A population of steel that could seed museums, monuments, and new armies across continents. Quantity became memory. Stand in Kubinka's halls or in Bovington's Cool Gallery, and the machine's character remains legible: the broad shoes, the weld seams, the turret's cramped promise, and a glacis whose very angle seems to shrug off a visitor's gaze as it once did incoming shot. Design turned into presence. In the Korean summer of 1950, T-3485s of the Korean People's Army rolled through Osan and Taijon against hastily gathered American and South Korean lines, outmatching light M24s and two M26 Pershings, 3.5-inch bazookas and air power bent